Right, this is day 1 of 3 and I'm going to show you how I feed my starter in preparation for making a loaf of sourdough bread. So I've got my starter which I've taken out of the fridge, I've got a bowl for mixing it in, scales, really important, white flour, strong white bread flour, but you can use any flour basically. You just want high gluten content to get that really good consistency of the sourdough, and I use a little bit of rye flour when feeding the starter as well, just purely for taste. I've got some water over here. I poured some out of the tap, comes out at about 15 degrees. I've topped it up with a little bit of water from a boiled kettle. I'm getting as close to 30 degrees as possible as I can on the thermometer. That's 29.2. The temperature of the water is actually really important to really help the reaction along. Your room temperature might be around sort of 20 degrees, 22 degrees or something. Just to get this kick started, you're aiming for about 30 degrees. I might top that up with a tiny bit more kettle water when I get to that point. Okay, so everything's done on the scales. Scales on. To feed the starter, get everything to 0, I want 50 grams of this starter. So pour it in there until I get to close to 50. There we go. 52 is close enough. Cool, now that goes back in the fridge. Zero the scales. Back to 0. 130 grams of your 30-degree water. There we go. And now give that a stir to really loosen up the starter and get it mixed in with the water. Okay, so very watery. The starter is dispersed. Okay, 0 the scales again. And then we want 50 grams of plain flour, 50 grams of rye, 100 grams altogether of whatever you've got. Okay, it's 50 of the white. Cool, 100 grams altogether. Give that a good mix. The reason I'm doing it in a bowl rather than just into another jar is so I can pop some cling film on the top, and then I can see how it's going over the 24 hours that I rest it for at room temperature to make sure that it's bubbling well. So you should be getting a kind of thick porridge or you know, an American style pancake batter kind of consistency. It doesn't have to be super smooth, it's just about getting all of the flour wet and mixed in. I like using one of these silicone spatulas so you can scrape down the edges of the bowl and make sure everything's right down in the mix. You can use your finger. I recommend not licking your finger when it has this batter on it. It tastes disgusting. We're all good. Chuck those in the sink. Okay, so yeah, just pop a plate on the top of this. We're going to leave it somewhere for about 24 hours. This time I'm going to put cling film on so that I can see how the bubbles are progressing. Now, some methods will say feed it twice in 24 hours, so feed it again after 12 hours. Basically take 50 grams of this and repeat the process. I found that I don't need to do that. The starter's really healthy, but it's all about just getting it live and active so that when we start the process of the bread baking, we've got a good active starter in there. So it's freshly fed, and it's going to evolve. We won't see a lot of bubble or activity happening for probably the first 8 or 9 hours, but then we should start to see individual bubbles. I'm doing this in the morning so that this time tomorrow morning I can do my bread mix and actually start the bread baking process during the day. So I'm just going to pop that here in the kitchen and we'll come and have a look at it in about 10 hours or so. Okay, so this is after about 10 hours. You can see lots of big bubbles on the surface have formed and popped, and the whole volume of the starter has increased by about, I don't know, maybe a fifth, maybe a quarter, as the whole thing's kind of swollen up a little bit. It's not quite at its most vigorous. What it'll do is plump up like this, get really bubbly, and then it will start to sag back down again. And that's kind of at the point where it's used up the food from the fresh flour that we've given it, and it's about ready to start making the bread. So for me, at the temperature that our kitchen is, about 22 degrees, 24 hours is absolutely fine for that feeding. Okay, so here's our starter after about 24 hours since we first fed it. You can see it's sagged back slightly down the side of the bowls, but it's still covered in the big old bubbles, and that's just gone past its peak. So ready to start making the bread. Right, so this is day 2 of 3, and this is where we start the actual bread mix and the bread baking itself. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make what's called a leaven, and this is kind of like the amuse-bouche of the whole process. There are a lot of recipes which will just say use so much starter, so much flour, add the water, mix it all together, knead it up, and there you go. I've used recipes like that, they're absolutely fine. When I started doing this method, it just seemed to work better, and the ratio seemed to be exactly right for what I want. So we've got our scales, we've got a big mixing bowl. We're making a tiny leaven, but we're going to make the whole process now for the rest of the loaf in this bowl. So a nice big mixing bowl. Same flour that we used for feeding the starter. So we've got the plain white, we've got this wholemeal rye flour again. I've got water at just about 30 degrees. Got my little doofers, and we've got our starter, which we fed and freshened 24 hours ago, which has been nice and happy, sitting at room temperature, and it's just sagged back down the bowl a little bit, so we know it's kind of hit its peak and it's started to go back. So it's using up all of the good food that we gave it from the flour. So for the leaven, we only need a tiny bit of this. We only need 40 grams of this starter. So having reset the scales, it's just a couple of little scoops in. So we get to our 40 grams. Okay, lovely. Now the rest of this is our starter for putting in the fridge for next time. So we'll pop the rest of this into a jar and whack it in the fridge. The jar of starter that we used yesterday, that's still absolutely fine. But this is the new fresh stuff that's been fed. So actually you can get rid of that old one. And what I tend to do is I have this on rotation. I bake a loaf every sort of 4 or 5 days. And rotate between the 2 jars and the 2 starters. Okay, job done. Get washed up. So a little bit of starter in the bottom, reset the scales. We're talking quite small quantities for the leaven, so it's 40 grams of the starter, it's 30 grams of flour, and again I'm going to do a mix 15 grams each of the white and the rye. So it's only 15 grams that we need in there. Bang on 15, 1 spoon. Total of 30 grams of flour, and then again our water at 30 degrees. Reset the scales, and we need 30 of this as well, so we've got a total of 100 grams of leaven. Cool. Give it a good old mix. And again, scrape down the sides, get it all down into the mixture at the bottom. Cool. That's the leaven ready to go. As I said, in a big old mixing bowl and with a loose fitting lid. This was a tight fitting lid. I've taken off the little rubber seal, so that just sits loosely on top. Okay, we've got our leaven, which has had just under 3 hours. It's firmed up in consistency. It's plumped up just a tiny bit. There are a few bubbles, but not too many. And it's ready to go for the rest of the mix. Onto the scales and zero those. Now, for this part, we need 400 grams of water, which goes in first, and that's going to mix in with the leaven and loosen it all up and make mixing in the flour easier. So again, at as close to 30 degrees as we can get, 400 millilitres or 400 grams. There we go. Give that a mix, loosen and break up the leaven into the slightly warm water. Now I can really start to smell it. I can smell a little bit of the rye flour in there coming out. I can smell that kind of warm, even though there's no yeast in it, that natural yeasty kind of smell. Okay, reset that, the scales again. So what we're looking for here is for, it's going to be a kilogram altogether of ingredients. So we've got 100 grams of the leaven, we've got 400 grams of water, so we need 500 grams of flour, and it can be any mixture that you like. You're going to get a springier, taller, more risen loaf, you know, with more big bubbles, the stronger the flour is that you use. So a strong white flour is going to make up the majority. Do it all with strong white flour if you can. If that's what you want, I add a little bit of wholemeal spelt flour and a tiny bit of the rye flour for texture and consistency. If you used a lot of spelt flour, which is absolutely fine if you like the flavour, don't expect the loaf to necessarily rise as much. Each flour gives the end loaf a slightly different characteristic. So I am going in with 400 of my 500 grams in total. I'm going in with 400 of strong white flour. That's about 300. Okay, 405. And I want about 60 or so of this wholemeal spelt. 470. And finish it off with about half that amount again of the rye flour to get to a total of 500. There we go, 500 grams of flour. So the rye for me adds a really nice flavour, just a little nuttiness to it. The spelt does the same, adds a little bit of nuttiness flavour. What the spelt does as well is gives the finished loaf a really nice texture, a slightly sticky, slightly chewy kind of element to the crumb, which I really like. Okay, done with the scales. All our ingredients are in. There is only one more ingredient to add, and that is salt. But we don't add that at this stage. What we're going to do is we're going to mix this together. Again, we're not kneading at all. We're literally just making sure all of the flour gets incorporated and gets wet. And this becomes a very sticky mix. But up until this point, we still haven't had to get our hands dirty or sticky. That will come later, I promise. But this is effectively a no-knead method. So it's just about mixing it, and we won't ever have to knead the bread. It'll do all the hard work on its own. Just get those last bits in there. Wipe those in the sink. So that is now going to sit for 1 hour. So at 12 is when I'm going to add the salt. And I'll show you if I can. It's just a very thick, sticky batter. Good stuff. Cool. Okay, so the mix, since we all put it together, has been sitting for an hour, and it's just kind of coagulated and combined itself. What we're going to do next is add the salt. And this is just 10 grams of salt. I use Maldon salt flakes for most of my cooking, which are quite large crystals. So what I tend to do is just give them a quick bash with a pestle and mortar to make them a little bit finer. So I'm looking for 10 grams, which is 2 good pinches. There we go. And just so that there's no big kind of, no big crystal rocks, just quick bash with a pestle and mortar to knock the edges off. Okay, so we sprinkle this over our mix. So that's 10 grams in on the kilogram of all the other ingredients. Now, the method that I'm using calls to pinch in the salt is what it's calling. And what that means is you get your hand wet and then you go in and you start to pinch the dough, and you're actually trying to, it explains, break the gluten bonds at this point. So it's important to actually kind of cut through the dough. I found that to be sticky, messy, and I don't know whether it was effective or not. What I've since started doing is grabbing just a little spatula. I started with a knife but realised I was scratching the bowl, but this is just a kind of a cake spreading type spatula,
And what I use is this to cut through. So I'm actually cutting through the dough. So I'm doing the same job. I'm breaking the gluten bonds as I'm mixing in the salt. And I do that about 20 times, just keep cutting through the dough. And then it'll have its next resting period. To stop it just sticking completely to this, I'm just going to run this under the tap very quickly. And then I just go at it, literally, if I can show you, kind of slicing through the dough here. So, as the method explained that I was reading up on, I'm actually trying to break it. There's a phase coming up later where we just stretch it, but this point here, I'm breaking the gluten bonds. So I'm slicing through the middle of it, and I turn the bowl and I slice again, and I turn the bowl and I slice again. And I do that, I don't know, about 20 times maybe. So while I'm doing that, I'm doing the bit of the method called pinching in the salt. So it's mixing the salt in, and it's just slicing through those first and early developed gluten bonds, which we will start to develop as the next bit goes on. So we still haven't got messy. I'm just going to use this to quickly go around and scrape the dough down the sides, so it's all sitting together in the bottom. There we go. So you can see all mixed in, getting a bit thicker, getting a bit more glossy as well on the actual surface of the mix. So lid back on, just loosely. So we pinched the salt. Now what we're going to do is we're going to start the stretching phase, and this is kind of, as it proves, we're going to then go in every now and again and stretch. So this next phase only needs to be 30 minutes. So 12:30, we're going to do the first stretch. Set a timer for 30 minutes, and then we'll come back to it. Okay, this is the fun bit where we actually start to get our hands dirty. What we're going to do, so it's rested for half an hour after the salt was pinched in, and we're going to do some stretching. So we do this 3 times with half an hour resting in between each. You can see it's starting to get a little glossy. First thing I'm going to do, I'm going to wet this hand. And that stops the dough sticking to my hand quite so much. I'm going to take a big scoop in on one side. I'm going to lift that up. I'm going to fold it over itself. Okay, so we're going to do this about 4 or 5 times. You can see it's really stretchy and sticky. And each time, turn the bowl, take the next quarter and lift it up over itself. Turn it again, do the same thing again. Turn it again, do the same thing again. Each time you stretch, you will realise and you'll feel that the dough is getting tougher and stiffer. That's why we only need to do it 4 or 5 times. Now I've got another tool in here somewhere. There we go. This little fella is really good just for, at this point, scraping down the sides of the bowl. So literally 4 or 5 stretches. That's all we need to do. Pop the lid on. I've already marked it up for my next half hour. And then we'll come back and we do the stretch again. So 3 stretches with half an hour in between. Okay, so we're going to do stretch number 2. So, and it's 1 o'clock, so at 1:30 we will do number 3. Okay, so again, I'm just going to wet my hand. You can see possibly a few massive bubbles coming up. And again, it's just starting to kind of gradually grow each time we let it sit. And it will have gone more elastic again. At the end of the last stretch, it was getting stiff. and then it relaxes and gets more elastic. And this is just all improving the gluten bonds and make it more elastic overall, as it kind of each time it's sort of doubling its elasticity. So again, with big scoop in, lift it up, a nice stretch, fold it over itself, a nice stretch, fold it over itself. That's 4, and it's already, I can't stretch it half as far. If I try for a 5th, yeah, it's just not going to let me. So I'll just tuck it over itself. Looks like that. Rinse my hand. And we'll pop the lid on. 1:30, we're going to do the 3rd stretch. Okay, ready for stretch number 3. Exactly the same as before. You can see, you might be able to see how smooth it's getting in between each stretch. It's not growing loads because we're only giving it half an hour, but it's more elastic. We turn and we stretch it, but it also stiffens up very quickly. So it's starting to come off the bottom of the bowl as I really pull it, but I want to get it, without ripping it, as stretched as possible. So again, 4 turns. Now, last time, so that was the 3rd stretch. So now we give it till 2:30. So a whole hour now where it's just going to rest. And then we're going to turn it out and we're going to do the shaping on the bench. Okay, this is the bit where we take it out of the bowl and we start shaping the bread. Normally white flour if you've got plenty of it, because there's a little bit of a shortage. I've just got some more brown bread flour which I'll be reverting to for most of the baking. It is a sticky dough, so be generous. You can always scrape this up, any excess stuff, and pop it back in the bag later, so you're not going to be wasting any, but a generous amount of flour over the surface. You can use your hands or you can use a scoop or a spatula or whatever you like, and scrape out, going round, releasing it from the side of the bowl, your bread dough right into the middle. Okay. Now the idea here is to give it a little bit of shape. It's to create some layers and some structure within the bread. It's all very elastic at the moment. So what we want to do is create the shape and the structure so that when we bake it, it's going to hold some of that dome shape for us and not just flop everywhere. So using our bread scraper, get a little bit of flour, because what you're going to do is try and get one side of it, and you're going to stretch it a little bit and fold it over itself. Okay? And then get the other side of it and stretch it back over itself. Okay, and then the top, the 2 sides that you haven't done. This is why you need plenty of flour here, because it can just get super sticky over the top. So I've done 4 folds, and then we're going to pop it upside down and just give it a tuck in on itself. What this bit does, keeps using bits of flour. This creates a bit of surface tension, okay? And again, that helps with the final structure of the loaf. So give it a tuck under, create that surface tension, chuck the flour all around it, because what we're going to do is what's called a bench rest. So this loaf's now going to sit here for 20, maybe 25 minutes, a dusting of flour over the top of it, make sure there's plenty around the edge. And so, of course, it's going to relax and it's going to gradually spread out. We don't want it sticking too much to whatever surface we're working on. Okay, so we will leave that there for 20 minutes, come back and do the next piece. bread has had its first rest, its bench rest, about 20-25 minutes. We're going to do another stretch and shape, and then we're going to put it into the proving basket, the banneton. Now this needs to be floured, and I use a bit of plain white bread flour, but I also use about half rice flour. That's because this is very, very dry, not very absorbent at all, and that helps when you're turning this out to bake it, and it stops any of the dough sticking to the basket. So we liberally flour the bowl that we're going to put it into, so that we've got that completely ready to go. Lots and lots of flour. And now we're going to do a second shaping. So just as we did before, now the seam side is down, so we're going to flip it over, and then we're going to stretch and fold it a few times and then drop it into the bowl. So first of all, flip it over. We're stretching again so we can shake off some of the excess flour so it doesn't get folded into the middle. And then we're just taking our corners, our edges, and folding them in. So that's 4, and then if it'll take it, you can do a bit more. That's about as much as this I can get out of this. I want to turn it onto its front. I want to get some flour on it, and I want to give it some real tension on the surface. So I'm tucking it round into itself. I've seen people who do a really nice technique of kind of scraping it across the board, and it really pulls that surface taut. But I'm pretty happy with that. And now we're going to flip it over so it's seam side up into the basket. Okay. That can just sit uncovered, or you can pop a tea towel over it, or anything you like. For about an hour is what I find. But what I'm looking for is, what's going to happen is this is going to fill out. This is going to start to fill out all the gaps in the bowl. The top surface will start to smooth, and then it will start to mound up. Where I want it to get to is so that the proving basket is completely full, and it's just, if I looked horizontally, it's just coming over the ridge, not by much. You don't want it to prove too much. If it's way over the top there, when you turn it out into your baking medium, it's going to collapse and it'll become too soft. Okay, but for now we'll just leave that, and as I say, about an hour, maybe 90 minutes, but we'll see where we've got to. So the mix has been proving for nearly 2 hours. It's a little bit cooler today, so it took a little while longer for it to get up to the height and size that I wanted. You can see that it's just starting to dome above the edge of the banneton, which is absolutely perfect. You could bake right now, but what I tend to do now is put it in the fridge overnight. It continues to prove, but it slows it right down, so it won't grow anymore. But it will develop much more flavour, and it also makes it firmer, so if you bake straight from the fridge into the hot oven, it's got less chance of collapsing. So whack it in the fridge overnight. Okay, this is day 3 of 3. It's 48 hours since we first fed the starter to start this process, and all we're going to do now is bake. The oven is up on full whack and has been for about half an hour, and my pan I'm going to bake in is in there. I use a springform cake pan which fits neatly over the banneton. You can bake in anything you want, a cloche, a cast iron pot with a lid on. There's loads of methods that you cook for half of the time with a lid on, then you take it off, keeps all the steam in there. And I put a pan of water in the bottom as well, about ½ litre of water, which produces lots of moisture in the oven. If you're cooking with something without a lid, I find it improves the consistency and creates a nice crust on the loaf. So pan's in the oven, going to get the sponge
out of the fridge. So this has been resting in the fridge overnight. It has continued to increase in volume slightly overnight. It's slightly more domed now. It's just up and over the edge of the banneton, but it's firm as well because it's been in the dough in the fridge overnight. Good sharp knife. This little fella holds a razor blade, which is great for scoring before I put in the oven. So I'm going to grab the cake pan, which is nice and hot, and this is the bit where it all goes wrong. Okay, nice hot cake pan. Turn this over. I find doing it that way tends to help so that I have less collapses when I tip it out, so I'm being really gentle. Work nice and fast, give it some scores. With one of these you really have to, you can go really lightly and it creates enough so that the surface can split, and that just stops it, you know, popping in places that you wouldn't expect. Straight back in the oven. And there we go, full heat for about 20-25 minutes, and then I tend to turn it down to about gas mark 7-8, which is what, about 220-230 degrees C, and that seems to come out right. Check it at about 50 minutes. If it's getting too dark, then I'll actually turn the oven off and just leave it in there for the last 10 minutes. But around about an hour for a kilo loaf at those kind of temperatures seems to do a good job. If you're baking with something with a lid, experiment. I've underbaked too many times, so I tend to leave it a little bit longer, and I really don't mind a crusty crust. Okay, that was 55 minutes in the oven. Not bad. So we'll just turn it out. It'll be ridiculously hot. And you can see it's risen up off the bottom as well. Nice hard base. Let's put that somewhere safe. And nice and crusty all round. I'm not going to cut into that for at least half an hour, probably a bit more, and I'll leave it on a rack to cool down. Cool, finished loaf. Let's see what we got. Very happy, nice rise. Bloomed and burst around the bottom a little bit. Really nice. Super satisfying. Some nice big bubbles, but are really soft. And I can feel already the slight stickiness to the surface that comes from that spelt flour. And the smell's great. Very happy. Hope that's helped.